There we go. I think this is recording. So, my name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic. I've got notes on all of these, which eventually, at some point, once I finish proofreading them, I'll publish. So, you'll have notes as well as talks. And they're in outline form, so they're pretty easy to navigate. Anyway, concept 12. So, let's read the World Service one. General warranties of the conference. In all its proceedings, the General Service Conference shall observe the spirit of the AA tradition, taking great care that the conference never becomes the seat of perilous wealth or power, that sufficient operating funds, plus an ample reserve, be its prudent financial principle, that none of the conference members shall ever be placed in a position of unqualified authority over any of the others, that all important decisions be reached by discussion, vote, and wherever possible by substantial unanimity, that no conference action ever be personally punitive or an incitement to public controversy, that, though the conference may act for the service of Alcoholics Anonymous, it shall never perform any act of government, and that, like the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous which it serves, the conference itself will always remain democratic in thought and action. So, this is the wordiest of all of the concepts so far, and there's an awful lot in here. So each body in AA is governed by its own set of rules. And the set of rules for the conference, the General Service Conference, is the Conference Charter. So there's one of those in Great Britain, the USA and Canada have their own. That's in the AA Service Manual. I imagine there's one in Australia as well. And this Conference Charter has got these general warranties. Now, what it means here is general overriding principles. And they've been extracted from the Conference Charter and plonked in here as Concept 12. So they're really in two places in the literature. They come from the Conference Charter, but they're plonked in here as part of Concept 12. So this concept stands apart from the other concepts. The rest of the concepts either tell you about the structure, the service structure, or they tell you if you're doing a job in that service structure, how you do that job. This one is different. It sets out much more abstract principles, which are then echoed through all of the other 11 concepts. So it's a fundamentally different type of concept. They're very, very difficult to change. If you don't like them, you're probably stuck with them. They can be changed only with the written consent of 3/4 of all of the directory listed AA groups who would actually vote on any such proposals. And that's therefore the same as the 12 traditions. So the 12 traditions require that. But here's an interesting thing. A lot of people think that you can only change the traditions with 3/4 of the AA groups voting in favour of the change, and it's not that. It's 3/4 of the AA groups who would actually vote on any such proposals. So you could have 1 in 100 groups taking part, and if 3/4 of that 1 in 100 vote for a change, you have a change, which is a very different state of affairs, given that very few groups actually do participate in decision making. So it's not as secure as people think it is. As with everything else, these general warranties of conference, on the surface, they just govern conference, but in practice, they govern everything. So these are general principles for the whole of the service structure because they form part of the concepts as well. And they can be applied certainly at group level and individual level. Let's have a look. Okay, so there's an over general principle which applies. It talks about the spirit of AA tradition. And I think it says, what does it say? It says, shall observe the spirit of AA tradition. That's the actual wording. Now, this is very interesting. It could say should observe the letter of AA tradition, but it doesn't. It says to observe the spirit. And there's that famous line from Corinthians, if indeed for you Corinthians is famous, where it says, "For the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life." And I've seen all sorts of situations in AA where someone makes up their mind for how things should be. They've already made up their mind. And then they say, right, how can we use the traditions to argue this conclusion we've already drawn? And that's not the way to do it. It's the other way around. You bring the situation to the traditions and then say to the traditions, what do you think of this? Lots of unpleasant arguments, in my experience in AA, stem from these sorts of debates where people have already made up their mind and then they're essentially misusing the traditions on the concepts. So this, what does it mean, the spirit of AA tradition? Rising above the whole thing is the higher power. And so if you were to sum up what the spirit of AA tradition means, it means giving God the casting vote, giving God the right of veto. Regarding how you apply the tradition to a particular situation, it's not really down to individual arguments. You can argue anything with the traditions if you try hard enough. I'm not going to give some examples here because it's not pleasant, and I don't want to get into analysing so-called sophistry. But people do argue the most arrant nonsense, which is clearly against the spirit of it. Actually, no, I will give one example, otherwise the point is dead in the water. I think it's pretty clear that the spirit of AA tradition is non-coercion and inclusiveness. So that runs through the big book and it runs through the traditions. We want everyone who is eligible to be here, to not feel pressurized. It talks all through the big book about not pressurizing people in any way at all. It talks in Tradition 3 about not imposing conformity of any sort. But I've seen a group argue that it's okay for the group to require group members to wear, men to wear trousers, women to wear skirts and high-heeled shoes or whatever. Maybe not the high-heeled shoes, but certainly the skirts with like a prescribed length for the skirts, on the basis that if we all look the same, it produces unity. Do you see what I mean? It's just, and it's so clearly against the spirit. You come in and suddenly there are all these requirements to belong in the room, and people are actually told off for wearing the wrong clothes to the meeting. I think this is a good example. There are lots of other ones as well. A second underlying principle, which pretty much speaks for itself, which is prudence, which is the midpoint between recklessness on one hand, which one might call Bill W, and extreme conservatism on the other side, which one might call Dr. Bob, and prudence is somewhere between Bill and Bob. Moving to the actual concept itself, the meat and potatoes of the concept, it contains 6 warranties, which is really, as I say, general principles. The first one, conference shall never become the seat of perilous wealth or power. It doesn't mean there's no wealth. It doesn't mean there's no power. It must never become the seat of perilous wealth or power. Now, it should be noted that the General Service Board and the charity and all of those things are really, certainly in a spiritual sense, the extension of conference. It is conference which gives them their life force, gives them direction, and ultimately channels funds. Now, the conference itself doesn't have a bank account, so in that sense, it can't become the seat of perilous wealth or power, but that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about the entire structure which is governed by conference. And so, in a practical sense, what this means is we're looking at where does the wealth actually accumulate? It accumulates in the bank accounts of the General Service Board. And two practical measures to make sure that the General Service Board doesn't get too rich is it can't accept contributions from outside AA, and individuals are capped in the amount that they can give to AA. So you can't have some billionaire giving millions and millions of spondulics to the General Service Board. And so these safeguards are pretty much all you need, because have you noticed how people will spend more on the coffee that they get on the way to the meeting, even though there is coffee available at the meeting? They'll spend more on that than they put in the pot. So the idea that group contributions are going to result in the General Service Office or General Service Board being awash in cash, that's not really a valid fear. If that does arise, there are ways of handling that. As to the question of the seat of perilous power, we've got some pretty simple measures in place to ensure that, which, if followed, will ensure that. First of all, rotation. So no matter how dreadful someone is, as long as you have rotation, eventually they'll go away. Someone can't stay there forever. You've got voting participation, which tempers bad decision making. That's concept 4. And you've got so-called careful chartering. So the subcommittees in this country have got terms of reference. You've got the memorandums of association, articles of association. You've got charters. You've got all sorts of legal documents which govern how something operates. And so you draft those in such a way that too much power doesn't accumulate in one person. And also, concept 7, the fact that the conference can pull the financial plug on the General Service Board by telling groups, oi, there's dirty work afoot, stop giving your money. Or they can suggest that. They can't tell groups that, but they can suggest that, because none of the money actually goes through conference, so it can only ever be suggestive. If the General Service Board were to start spending money on all sorts of inappropriate projects, like, I don't know, a viaduct or something, then the conference will be able to effectively stop that. Warranty 2. Sufficient operating funds plus an ample reserve be its prudent financial principle. Now, I don't understand why I've written what I've written under the notes here. Oh, that's why. Okay. So, what the General Service Board must maintain is a couple of things. You need operating capital, which allows for ups and downs, financial ups and downs throughout the year. And then you have a second tier, which is the ample reserve. Sometimes people think that the General Service Office or General Service Board or whatever is awash with cash because it seems to be holding more than its prudent reserve. But that's good and right. It's not the prudent reserve is not just what you've got in the bank account, it's your operating funds plus the reserve. And this is not well understood. People often think that too much money is being held, whereas in fact what you've got is operating funds plus the ample reserve. And the ample reserve is typically 1 year's operating expenses, so that if the funding were cut completely, it could still rumble on for a year without having to sack people or do anything else or shut down offices. And it should be understood by people in AA that for the office to operate, this for the corporation to operate. I'm going to call it the corporation. For the corporation to operate, it has to have these two things, and so that money has to come from individuals. And it's noted, I think, by Dennis F., that people are very good at giving their time to AA, but they're not so good at giving their money to AA. Would that we were as good at giving our money as we are our time. If you think of how much you earn in an hour, and then how willing you are to go to a meeting for an hour, but if someone asked you to spend your net earnings from an hour's work on AA, suddenly you'd be up in arms. And also, well, a lot of people would be up in arms. So I think that's a good thing to consider. Um, what else do we need to know? Uh, the way AA is structured in Great Britain is that the funding comes partly from a surplus on the sale of literature and partly from group contributions. I think the original intention was that the contributions go up and down, and so the surplus on, or the reserve which is built up from the sale of literature, covers the ups and downs. However, the essay is a little unclear to me, at any rate, in its argument. One thing which is clear is it says that if uh, someone pays for their own literature, if a AA member pays for their own literature, they're practicing the principle of being fully self-supporting through their own contributions right from the beginning. And that's a principle which is set out not only in Tradition 7, but in various places in the Big Book. I think they learnt at an early stage. If the AA member at the start is seen as a service recipient, and AA is seen as a service provider, it keeps the AA member infantilized. And my experience is that people don't look after literature you give them for free. It talks about, in chapter 7, the relationship between sponsor and sponsee, that the sponsor's work should never be on the service plane, which is an odd thing. You'd think, well, service is good. What it means by that is you don't turn the sponsee into a service recipient, with the sponsor being a service provider, or it mutilates the relationship. The job of the sponsor is to help the sponsee to stand on her or his own feet and rely on God rather than on other people. So people should pay for their own literature. If they can't, you come to an arrangement where it gets the group defrays the expense and the person pays it back. But this bending over backwards to accommodate newcomers who don't want to pay their own way, although it's very kind in its motivation, I think it's not in accordance with these principles. So this is relevant for the argument as to whether AA should publish literature at cost or below cost, whether it should subsidize or whether it should be above cost. The principle we've already set out means that it shouldn't be subsidized. So you're left with two choices: at cost or above cost. And there are two ways of doing it. Either you publish the literature at cost and rely 100% on group contributions, in which case you're going to have to tell the groups to start contributing more, because currently in most countries, maybe between 40 and 60% of the funds for AA, for the service structure for the corporation, come from literature. Or you treat the surplus on the literature as a contribution in its own right. And I think that's exactly what is done right now. That and Bill is clear on this point, that the surplus which is made should not be viewed as a profit in the ordinary sense, because uh, uh, it's not funds which are then either being ploughed into the book publishing business, or funds which are then going to the shareholders. A genuine form of contribution. My only problem with this is that group contributions are voluntary. So people make the contribution because they want to make the contribution. Whereas with the literature, if you put a margin on top, so well, that's your contribution. The individual is not given the choice as to whether or not they want to make that contribution. If they want the book, they have to make the contribution. And to me, you heard it here first, this is a breach of concept 7 because it weakens the power of the purse. Because if AA hates what the corporation is doing, but it needs the literature, it has to keep buying the literature. So it has to keep funding it, whether or not it wants to, because the literature sales automatically fund the operation. So I think we've got it wrong. I personally believe that the literature should be at cost, 100%. That it should be just completely neutral, and all of the funding should come from the fellowship, which will increase the power of the purse. Warranty 3, that none of the conference members shall ever be placed in a position of unqualified authority over any of the others. Now, this one seems like a bit of a dodo. I'll tell you why. It's because we've already covered it in some of the other concepts. But remember, the conference charter is separate than the concepts, so you're going to get some duplication. When you pull over material from the conference charter, it's going to necessarily duplicate material in the concepts. What do we mean by this? We've already got voting participation, which means, I'll give you an example. Conference can't act like a little czar ruling over the General Service Board because the General Service Board get to vote at conference. So their voice is going to be heard. The fact they disagree with something is going to be visible, physically visible. People have to stand up to vote, or they have to hold a card in the air. It's physically visible to the conference. It would be a hard-hearted conference indeed, which would knowingly override the physically manifested will of the General Service Board to which it is giving instructions. So the voting participation in Concept 4 is a key measure to ensure that you don't have people acting like czars. The second one is the right of appeal, the minority report or the petition for a grievance. So we've got Concept 4 and Concept 5 implementing Warranty 3. Warranty 4 is a goodie, that all important decisions be reached by discussion, vote, and wherever possible by substantial unanimity. And note, all important decisions. Some groups insist that every decision be reached by discussion, vote, and whenever possible by substantial unanimity. Let me just turn the page. So this is the defense against, and here's a wonderful phrase, a hasty or overbearing authority of a simple majority. Sometimes you've got a 51% which wants to force something through against the very strongly held feelings or opinions of the other 49%. So substantial unanimity, you basically you want to have everyone on board for the purposes of unity. So you continue discussing and reformulating the plans or the ideas until you have substantial unanimity. From a practical point of view, however, what you deem to be substantial unanimity is 2/3 of the people in the room, of the voters, for major decisions. Although you can stipulate more, so conference can stipulate that it be 3/4 or even 4/5 or some other fraction for certain categories of question or specific questions. And the decision on what majority you're going to go with, that itself can be 50-50. Now, although the tradition in AA is to treat 2/3 as adequate for substantial unanimity, at group level, for instance, my view is that it's still not good to alienate 1/3 of the room. And so I've seen situations where you've already totally got the majority, you need to force something through, but you still want to listen to the minority opinion to find out if there is any way of implementing the measure or altering it slightly, adding to it to mitigate the concerns of that remaining 1/3. This is very good for group unity. And I think we've probably mentioned this before. You continue to discuss. If anyone wants to change their vote, then you revote. And you keep doing that until no one is changing their mind anymore. Whilst movement is still taking place, it hasn't, the lava hasn't settled yet. You've got to let it settle and solidify at a particular percentage. We're always speeding through this. Warranty 5, that no conference action ever be personally punitive or an incitement to public controversy. This is oh gosh, this is a long one. Maybe we're not doing so well. So in AA, you avoid anything which looks like or is the attack or punishment of an individual. And the reason you don't need to punish anyone is anyone who strays too far morally will be cut down by alcohol, as Bill puts it. So you don't need to appoint yourself as the instrument of God's justice. Next point, don't engage in public controversy, don't engage in public defense. So if someone attacks AA, if someone wants to discuss AA at the public level, leave them to it. Occasionally, something needs to be done to protect the fellowship. An example, and this is the only common one, is where you have a serial treasurer who has got sticky fingers and deep pockets and a serpent-like tongue to wheedle his way. It's almost always men, wheedle their way into lots of groups and lies to venues and things like that. Occasionally, you have to tell the other groups, psst, you want to watch so and so, he's got form. Is this a breach of warranty 5? No, because it's the purpose is not to punish. The purpose is not to incite public controversy. The fact that it's controversial, the fact that it's effectively punitive, is secondary and regrettable. And this type of situation, this isn't the only situation where you have to balance, uh, uh, you've got the balancing act of tradition 1, a group welfare coming first and personal welfare coming a close second, but group welfare does trump personal welfare. So to have it the other way round, you're favouring the individual over the group, which means that if you've got 30 people in a group, the idiot that you're letting shout and be abusive and touch up the women is being favoured over the group if you don't exclude or shut down or do whatever is necessary to protect the group in that situation. So the group has to come first. And in that case, when you're excluding someone either temporarily or permanently, and there's a procedure for that, and you do it kindly, and you do everything you can, you try out everything before you resort to that ultimate measure. It's not punitive in purpose, it's protective in purpose, but it's going to be seen as punitive by the individual in question. But you can't help that. Unfortunately, it's a necessary cost. What else? What if there is public attack? So Bill was kind of optimistic in the traditions and the concepts where he was basically like, everyone loves AA and it's so nice and we've got so many friends and everyone agrees with us and everyone thinks we're wonderful. Well, maybe that was true. Maybe that was true then. Well, I think there were other voices, but anyway, that's a different matter. The fact is today, there's a fair amount of public attack. So the whole, you've got individual scandals associated with individual groups and situations. You've got a attack of AA's so-called religious aspect. Uh, I'm going to share an opinion here. Um, AA clearly has religious roots. I mean, the history documents that. We use prayers, we use the word God, which will necessarily invoke association with religion. Lots of groups in America use the Lord's Prayer, which, however you cut it, is a Christian prayer. Um, we uh, we recite creeds rather than the reading. How it works at the beginning of the meeting is much more like the recitation of a liturgy than it is the reading of passage for information purposes. The purpose is not for information. Why are you reading the same piece of information every single time? There's other stuff going on. There's all sorts of ritualized behavior. Those meetings where people shout out certain things during the traditions. It's exactly like the responsiveness in certain Christian services where, the blah, 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 and also with you, the blah, 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 and we think not. If you don't want people to think AA is religious, how about you stop acting like it's religious? That would be a really good way to forfend the accusation that we're a religious organization. It's no good saying it's not religious, it's spiritual. I mean, there's some truth to that, but honestly, that doesn't cut, that might work in AA where people are very happy to, live by catchphrase, but that's not really going to work on the outside. But anyway, there's criticism of that. There are lots of different approaches to the treatment of alcoholism. If you read the the Lancet, which is the um, one of the foremost medical publications, certainly in this country, there was a I don't know if it was a meta-analysis or a Cochrane review or something on treatments for alcoholism, and AA was certainly up there as this is in the category of the most effective treatments, but it wasn't the only one. Now, who is going to benefit from which treatment is a different question. And we do have the phrase in AA, alcoholics of our type, implying that there are other types. But anyway, there are lots of grounds on which AA can and is criticized. How do we deal with it? We keep our big, fat mouths shut. This is what Warranty 5 says. There's a wonderful line. Bill was no slouch. He said, unreasonable people are stimulated all the more by opposition. How would he know that? If you argue with them, it just makes it worse. My personal experience with argumentative people is it's never about the argument. It's about enjoying the exercise of power. But anyway, if you leave them alone, eventually they'll subside. Oh, a footnote. When people send me aggressive texts or nasty little texts, it doesn't happen. It happens far less often than you might suspect. But when it happens, I've had people say, you need to block them. No. If you block someone, you're erecting like a permanent wall, and then the wall becomes the objective for them to surmount. If you respond with complete silence, it's like someone dropping a pebble down a well, and they listen out for the plop at the bottom of the well, but there's no plop. There's literally like the attack disappears into nothingness. And it's brilliant. It drives them crazy as well, which is so enjoyable. People usually subside if you leave them alone for long enough. Now, there's one exception to this. If the attack persists and appears to be based on misinformation, you can correct the misinformation, but what it suggests in the concept is pretty radical, pretty unusual. It says, do it through back channels. Don't do it in official communications. Don't do it in the public domain. And certainly don't do it in such a way as to constitute a springboard for fresh assault. Don't question their motives. Don't try to get into their internal psychology. Stick to the facts, but do it through a third party who is in good communications with both sides. To me, that's fascinating. It's a sort of Weedly way of doing things, but I think it's right. Um, if criticism is partly valid, then you acknowledge the person and thank them, but do so privately, not publicly, because you want to stay out of the public um, controversy. And in any case, don't exhibit anger or be punitive or be aggressive in your intent. I know that's probably a little bit difficult for some of us. Um, I was, I shouldn't share this, but there we go. I was at a meeting once somewhere in Western civilization. How's that for anonymous? Where one after one, people were saying, in AA, I found my voice. And it sounds so as if they never spoke before then. I don't believe what it's a metaphor for something. But they don't say what for. They just say, I found my voice. It sounds like they were literally muzzled and they sort of found their voice. Like, I don't know what it means. Anyway, my friend who's Glaswegian and she's about 300 years sober. And she said, yes, I won't do the accent because I can't. Um, she said, in AA, I found my voice. And you know what? I found it was a sledgehammer. So if we're going to reply in public, boy, do you want to put it past a comms department or something just to be complete. Where is this relevant? I'll give you an example, just in a completely different context. Step 9. When I'm in the early training stages of a sponsee with step 9 who, for whatever reason, has to write a letter because the person won't see them or they need to be approached with particular tact or caution. There are 1,000 situations. Sometimes a letter is the only way to get the message across without being interrupted, railroaded, or diverted onto another topic or attacked. Sometimes you have to do it in writing to get the words into the domain of the other person. Sometimes it has to be in writing. This is the other big example where, some people, I know this is not true of any of you, some people are not so good at listening and they're not so good at actually taking on board what a person is saying. They hear what they want to hear. There was someone I sponsored many years ago who was a little bit reactive, and they would react and say, I can't believe you're telling me blah, blah, blah. And you're like, if you scroll up, sweetheart, and look at what I've actually said, it's totally different than how you've interpreted it. So sometimes it needs to be in writing. The amendment needs to be in writing so that someone can reread it and realize it doesn't say what you thought it said when you were in reacto mode. I certainly get emails the whole time from clients which send me into a squawking rage, and I look at it the next day and I'm like, there's nothing here. What was my problem? Anyway, so you're looking at your sponsee's first draft of an amend letter, and it is full of covert attack and manipulation and general weirdness, and it needs to be stripped down to being absolutely neutral, operating on one level only, entirely factual, sincere, and respectful. And that's quite a journey for some of us to go from one extreme to the other extreme. So public communications need to be handled by people who are fit. This is concept 11, fit to handle public communications. Not everybody is fit to handle public communications. Abuse of the AA name. So if people want to use the AA name for this, that, or possibly the other, you privately approach them and say, you might want to stop doing that. What you can do Actually, there's something that Bill says, which is fascinating. I may have misread it, but Bill says you can follow up with other resources of persuasion as we may have, and these are often considerable. I don't know if, as a New Yorker, he meant you take a little trip down to Little Italy and get your get your friend Don this or Don that to go and pressurize whoever it is up in, Westchester County to stop, you know, to shut down their AA yoga center. Um, but he doesn't go into what these resources of persuasion are. And I literally have no idea. I cannot conceive of what he means. It's very intriguing. Anyway, what you can do, sometimes you can't really stop people from using the AA name, and if you try to, you'll just get bogged down in a court case and everybody will have an opinion on it. So you can't stop them from doing it. You can inform them privately, but what you can do is tell the rest of the world, by the way, they're using our name. We don't want them to. We're not going to, legally or physically prevent them from doing it. But just be aware, just because someone says something is AA does not mean it's AA. And if you have any doubts as to whether it's OA, give Susan a call on this number at the General Service Office. She'll look it up. She'll tell you. Here we go. So you deal with it with public information. And this is usually enough to dissuade people because it affects their reputation and pocketbooks if rather publicly it's revealed that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. So there are remarkably few examples of the AA name being misused in that way. Mostly the most egregious example you do see is conferences, which are not conferences and conventions and things, and weekend retreats, which are not subject to the custodial oversight of the fellowship through the service structure, and they see an AA retreat or AA convention. And I mentioned this before, Bob D's one in Las Vegas. Um, certainly in its main title doesn't have the word AA in it. The word AA crops up elsewhere, but it's just the State Line Retreat, and that means it can legitimately operate outside the service structure because it doesn't present itself as being answerable to the service structure. Internal disputes. So the corporation or the board should not get involved in internal disputes within AA. It can offer to mediate, but that is it. Whatever is happening at local level should be resolved at local level. So the lower levels, and this is why you can't appeal to a lower level. You could only appeal to a higher level. And if you're an intergroup, region is a lower level, not a higher level. So you can't appeal downwards, you can only appeal upwards. Who you appeal to is the groups. That's it. That's who has the higher authority. And this is not well understood. People sometimes look to intergroup as a higher authority over the groups, region as a higher authority over intergroup, the General Service Board as a higher authority over conference, and it's not, it's the other way around. So that's why the lower levels can serve as mediators, but cannot be adjudicators or arbitrators or anything like that. They can simply help with the communications and, maybe chair a mediation meeting. Bill allows the spectre of schism, some sort of split in AA, to loom, and he says, how could it happen? Well, a bit of AA could try and ally itself with an outside agency or ideology. A bit of AA could want to secede and separate itself off. His view is that conference should wish them well. That's all. If you want to leave, leave. Bye-bye. We'll see you later. I mean, you'll be back. So it's fine. You go and do what you need to do if you want. And he talks about, there's a whole list of experiments that people have tried where people eventually come back. So we don't need to police these weird little things on the fringes of AA, or even these great big splits within AA. If someone wants to go and do something else, let them go and do something else. And if they want to call it AA, maybe they have to call it AA. I don't know if I've mentioned this story before. I'm going to pretend it was Athens. It wasn't Athens, where the local AA, there was the official local AA website, which was like athensaa.com, but it was terrible. It kind of didn't work. So the groups set up an alternative website called aathens.com. So you had athensaa.com and aathens.com. And all the groups split, either they supported the official one or they supported the unofficial one. And the fellowship was split down the middle. And an American gentleman who was sober 20 years, which at the time seemed like a really long time, but not so much now. He said, if you can stay sober in AA, you can stay sober anywhere. Because of the schism between the two. I think it's been resolved now. And this is the thing, if you wait for long enough, these things tend to resolve themselves. It's trying to force resolution, trying to stop people go that other way, trying to force people to come back. Stop it. If they want to leave, let them leave. One of the best pieces of advice, just in life generally, treat mixed messages as no. Wouldn't that save a lot of problems? So, with sponsees, I've stopped fighting. If you're not totally enthusiastic about what I offer, let's just stop it now. It's the worst drain of your energy to have sponsees who are lackluster and only half interested and kind of argue with half of what you say, or they submit grudgingly, or you have the sighing and the face pulling. And if you're not enthusiastic, find someone you're enthusiastic about. And then you can find out whether you're truly willing. If you can't find anyone you're enthusiastic about in AA, why are you here? That's the real question. So take mixed messages as no. And my life has got so much better since I stopped trying to drag people along with me who kind of were only half into it. So if people want to leave, let them leave. Brian, my old sponsor, says about sponsees that stomp off, he says, they always come back one way or another. And it's very interesting how, sometimes they come back just to say hello, but nothing is forever. Those splits are never forever. There's always something that comes back even 10, 20 years later. What else have we got? Just looking at my notes here. I'm going to have to speed things up slightly. Warranty 6, that though the conference may act for the service of Alcoholics Anonymous, it shall never perform any acts of government, and that like the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous which it serves, the conference itself will always remain democratic in thought and action. And so Warranty 6 really contains two principles: no act of government, democratic in thought and action. Those one might be the corollary of the other, but that's another argument. And the reason why we don't need government is because it's for various reasons. Each group is autonomous. It's autonomous legally. This is why we don't incorporate AA. It's so that each group can remain autonomous. I mean, the corporations are obviously incorporated, but the fellowship as a whole is not. This is tradition 9. We don't organize ourselves in any formal way, and that's what it means. If individuals don't abide by spiritual principles, if they're alcoholics, they'll eventually drink. If groups breach the traditions badly enough, eventually they'll dissolve. So you let people take responsibility for themselves. You let groups take responsibility for themselves. You don't need to take the responsibility for them. So this Warranty 6 is a huge exercise in Al-Anon detachment. As a friend of mine reports an Al-Anon member in Texas saying, um, leave him lay where Jesus flang him. Step over the body and get on with your life. You leave people to, you help people if they want it, but you don't. A friend of mine uses the verbs fix, change, control as a single word. She says you need to stop fix, change, controlling. It's a single fix, change, control. Stop it. General principle, acting in the spirit of mutual respect and love. Um, and there's a wonderful phrase he uses as well, freedom under God, in his likeness and image, and Bill's very keen on this idea. It runs through the traditions and the concepts and language of the heart as well. He also talks, and these are just straightforward principles: take no actions in haste, anger, or recklessness. Respect and protect all minorities. And be prudently on guard against tyrannies which are either great or small, and tyrannies by the majority or tyrannies by the minority. And we've talked about this before, how a couple of psychologically powerful people in a group who've got an axe to grind can spook the rest of the group and effectively be in charge, because people are scared of their reaction. If we don't do what Bobby wants us to do, there'll be tears, there'll be screaming abdabs, they'll be running out and running back. There will be, and so subconsciously people just do what the craziest person in the room wants to do, because they're frightened of standing up to them or sustaining the response. And so there's overt tyranny and covert tyranny, and being very, very upset by everything the whole time is a covert form of tyranny, in my view. Look what you did to me. In order for you to get rid of your guilt for how I feel, you have to change. That's the mechanism. I know you've never encountered that. And just a few final points. So applying the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, which means that I sponsor each person differently, and it changes over time. And I'm becoming much, much more flexible and intuitive than I used to be. I'm pretty rigid on some things, but I'm much more flexible on others. What else do we have? So this capping of individual gifts, I'm on to the application of these principles in all my affairs. So AA caps the gifts of individuals to the corporation or the charity. And this reflects this notion of avoiding excessive reliance on individuals. And in my life, I want to avoid excessively relying on individuals. I encourage sponsees to talk to a whole range of people. When I take someone through the steps, I get them to look at different steps with different people as well as me, so that they're not just getting everything from me. And similarly, I want to not over-rely on a sponsor. In some parts of the world, let's not name them, there are very rigid sponsorship structures. And, there are merits to that. But to me, I think it's healthier to not have that personal reliance or over-adulation or pedestalizing of a sponsor. The avoidance of excessive accumulation of funds and power, and the principles I try to follow are with like material stuff in my life, it's just there to support the activities, and the activities are just there to support whatever God wants to do through me. That's what my life is about. I get very easily distracted by material things, not necessarily like acquiring shininess, but establishing security in some way. That's the side that I on. Uh, and it's a breach of concept 12 to me. It's an excessive focus on what is security but a form of power. Sheldon in Santa Monica says, I want just enough money so that I don't need to rely on God. I don't want more than that, just enough. I follow the principle of having operating funds to cover ups and downs plus an ample reserve, which is 1 year's expenses as savings at call if I need them. And you have to forego a lot for a while until you build that up. We've talked about the principle of empowerment rather than charity. And this is what you want to do with what I want to do with sponsees, is to empower them to apply the program and make the program their own and rely on the higher power, not on me. Throughout concept 12, there is this idea of individual responsibility for the whole. It's partly there in the democracy, it's partly there in the funding structure. So I'm responsible for my part, but for no more than my part. So I can breach that by just leaving the world to its own devices. As God's going to look after it, I obviously have no part, which is to err on one side, and secondly to tip over into worry or fretting or other things about the world. And here's the line you want to memorize and repeat to yourself 7, that's 7 times a day. We try not to indulge in cynicism over the state of the nations, nor do we carry the world's troubles on our shoulders. That's more of an ideal than a statement for most people, but there we go. And to be flexible about the role I have to play in AA or the community or society. Sometimes I need to play a bigger role. I'm not stepping up to the plate. Sometimes I'm getting too big for my boots. I need to come back down again. And if you want to read about that, it's not conference approved literature, but Alice in Wonderland, when she encounters the mushroom, where if you eat from one side of the mushroom, it makes you smaller. If you eat from the other side of the mushroom, it makes you bigger. And you can't tell until you've eaten. So you need to keep a supply from both sides of the mushroom to basically gradually, you titrate the doses and calibrate until you reach the right size. And so humility is about not being about, it's not about being tiny, it's about being the right size. So sometimes you need to grow to be the right size, sometimes you need to shrink to be the right size. I've told this story before, but it's worth telling again. The chap that goes to his sponsor and says, everyone's treading all over me. And the sponsor says, that's because you take up too much room. Whenever they go to put their foot down, you're there in the way. Take up less space and people won't tread on you so much. Discussion, vote and substantial unanimity. To aim in any group, whether it's an AA group or a family or a circle of work colleagues, to get everyone on board, be prepared to compromise greatly, and if in doubt, yield. There's almost nothing that can't legitimately be yielded on. Far less is very important than I once thought it was. Warranty 5. Handling criticism and attacks in my life. Don't punish, don't attack, don't argue. Anthony DeMello talks about almost all debate and discussion in society is not actually debate or discussion. It's an attempt to get the other person to see things the way that you do. Why? Why should everyone see things the way you do? Who put you in charge? So, and it drives people crazy when you say, I can present some views, but I'm not here to discuss them. People hate it because they want the back and forth. Avoid public controversy. Trust the universe's self-correcting mechanisms. The reason I don't need to correct most things is they'll correct themselves within time. If there is some kind of controversy, to correct people's errors of fact and let it go at that. So you make sure other people have the right building blocks, but you don't construct the building for them. Privately acknowledge valid criticism. And as I said before, when people want to go, whether it's sponsors, sponsees, relationships, jobs, just let them go swiftly and promptly and cleanly. And the last point, I've read this before, this notion of freedom under God. Whilst traveling on a train, the author of Novodok found himself in the company of free thinkers. Taking note of the author's rabbinic garb, they attempted to draw him into philosophical debate. The author told them, "You call yourselves free, for you have liberated yourselves from the restrictions of religious belief. In fact, you are slaves. I have disciplined myself to the extent that I am prepared to do whatever my Creator asks of me. You, on the other hand, are ruled by your passions and desires. That is real slavery." And so I think this, I'm going to finish on this. This is the idea of freedom under God. If you're freed from everything in the world, serving God looks like a narrow path. It's the other way around. The world is the narrow path, and serving God is the huge freedom. That's all I've got. Thanks for listening.